Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. Welcome back, guys. I hope you're having a blessed and awesome week. Today, we are going to be talking about the Civil War. We've already addressed some of the central causes for the war, including slavery and preservation of the Union, states' rights, economic differences, as well as westward expansion. And now it's time to address, finally, this most climactic event. Now, the American Civil War began in 1865. I'm sorry, scratch that. It ended in 1865. It began in 1861, in April of 1861. And the final straw that sort of broke the camel's back, if you will, was the firing upon Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. This is actually a very interesting sort of event. The culmination of the events that led, or the thing that led to the attacking upon Fort Sumter, really had to do with Lincoln's being elected to the presidency. Lincoln was elected in 1860. He received less than 50% of the vote. I think it was in like 40% of the vote is what Lincoln ultimately received. His name didn't even appear in the Southern ballot. And the response of Southerners to Lincoln's election to the presidency was to secede from the Union. One of the things you need to understand is that folks in the South, particularly South Carolina, they viewed Abraham Lincoln as a John Brown kind of abolitionist, as a radical abolitionist. And that's not really what Abraham Lincoln was. Abraham Lincoln was an anti-slavery advocate. In fact, many people in the Republican Party didn't think Abraham Lincoln had gone far enough in his attack upon slavery. In fact, what Lincoln's position was, his public position, was that slavery should be protected in the states where it already exists. It just shouldn't be allowed to expand into new territories. But despite what Lincoln would say, many Southerners thought Lincoln and the Republican Party was just hell-bent on ending slavery. And so when Lincoln is elected in 1860, they decide to secede from the Union. South Carolina will be the first. Other states will follow: Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, eventually Texas, Virginia, Louisiana. They all will eventually secede. And so when Lincoln becomes president, he gives his inaugural address in March of 1861, and March 4th, I believe it was, March 4th, March 5th. The day after he gives his inaugural address, he's informed that Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor is low on supplies, and Lincoln has to do something. Now, one of the things you need to understand about Abraham Lincoln, and this is significant to understanding the overall trajectory of the war, is that Lincoln does not believe that the South has left the Union, right? Here's the metaphor I normally give in class, okay? The South viewed itself as living at home, and then it decided to move out of the house and get its own apartment and live its own life. Therefore, when it seceded from the Union, it believed not only did it had every right to do so, but they effectively viewed themselves as no longer part of the United States, much in the same way that when you move out of your parents' house, you move into your own apartment, you're your own person now. You don't have to listen to what mom and dad say anymore. This is the position of the South. It's why they create their own government, the Confederate States of America. Lincoln's view is drastically different. Lincoln's view is this: the South hasn't left the Union. Instead, what they've done is they've packed their bags, they've threatened to run away from home, so they throw Teddy into the suitcase and they go in the backyard and they say that they've ran away from home, but really all they've done is go to the backyard and they're throwing a fit, and what the parents' job now is to bring the kid back into the house and settle them down. Lincoln's view is much more in line with the kid has ran away in the backyard and they just need to be brought back into a right relationship with the household. So there's a very different view here, and this is an important view because when we start talking about the Civil War, it's very easy to want to lay blame on the South as though they're the bad guy, right? Because we always want to find somebody as being the enemy, the villain, right, in any particular war. And in many wars, it's very easy to identify who that is. But in the Civil War, it gets more complicated. Because here's the question you have to ask yourself. Did the South have the right to secede from the Union, which ultimately results in the American Civil War? If you believe that the South had the right to leave, then Lincoln becomes an aggressor who's invading a sovereign independent country. If you do not believe that is true, then the South is doing everything it can to rip the nation, rip the Union apart, and destroy the sovereignty of the United States. But we have to ask ourselves this very important question. Can you exit a union if you so choose to do so? I mean, one might pose the question in this way. How many of you would join into a marital union under the presumption that you could never get out if you wanted to under any circumstances? And I think when the Confederacy, or when the Southern states put their pen in their hand to the Constitution, they believed that they had every right to secede from the Union when they wanted to do, and so they did. Now, these are important questions, but the reason why this is significant is because the attack upon Fort Sumter demonstrates a tension between the Southerners' point of view that they have left the Union and that Fort Sumter is in their territory and therefore their territory or property, versus that of Lincoln, who believes that the Union has not fallen away. The only thing he's dealing with are a bunch of children who are acting in a state of rebellion, and according to the Constitution, he has the right to bring them back into the Union. And so this is what he's going to do. Now, one of the things I will say, and I think this is important, is that the war does not begin until April 12th, 1861 is when the war begins. But understand that the South had begun a process of secession many, many months before the attack on Fort Sumter. There had been no violence. And some historians have blamed Abraham Lincoln for starting the Civil War, that it's ultimately his fault, because Lincoln's response to hearing that Fort Sumter was low on supplies was to send supplies into the area. And the Southern Confederacy, under the presidency of Jefferson Davis, he was the first and only president of the Confederacy, they told Lincoln, if you send ships in here, we're going to basically shoot upon Fort Sumter. In fact, they had already, they meaning the Confederacy, had already begun to take certain forts in Charleston Harbor that had once been the possession of the Union. And so Lincoln, knowing that his actions could cause a war, he did them anyways. And again, this isn't to blame Lincoln. Lincoln's commander-in-chief, and based upon his own perception of the situation, this is what he's got to do. But nonetheless, the attack on Fort Sumter inaugurates war. Coffee break. Now, after the attack on Fort Sumter, this conflict that erupts, it's going to last 4 years. It lasts until April 9th, 1865, when eventually Robert E. Lee will surrender the armies of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. But when the war initially erupted, nobody thought it was going to last very long. In fact, the strategy, the plan that Abraham Lincoln eventually came to adopt, he did not adopt at the outset of the war. The name of this strategy was called the Anaconda Strategy, and it was a three-pronged strategy. But the strategy itself was a protracted process. That is, it was a strategy that was going to take a while. It involved blockading the southern ports, it involved protecting Washington, D.C., and it involved trying to move into Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy. And in Lincoln's mind, initially, he thought, no, this plan is going to take too long, and the war isn't going to last that long. In fact, most folks who thought that the war would last long, they were deemed to be insane. And ultimately, the war lasted much longer than anyone anticipated, and it cost way more lives than anybody anticipated. But at the outset of the war, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. He does blockade the South. One way in which he attempts to fight the war is he suspends the writ of habeas corpus. He was heavily criticized for doing this because he, as the president of the United States, doesn't in fact have the authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And basically what that means is if you suspend the writ of habeas corpus, it means you can just arrest people for whatever reason you want and throw them in jail and throw away the key. And Lincoln does this initially along the railroad route in Maryland. There is some difficulty there in moving troops and getting railroad, items through. And so he does that along the railroad line, but then eventually he suspends it for the entire country. And so he does violate civil liberties in order to hold the Union together. And remember, that's his main objective, hold the Union together. Now, part of the reason why Lincoln is going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, one of the reasons why he does not issue an Emancipation Proclamation right away is because there are still some border states like Kentucky and Missouri who are still part of the Union, who have not seceded, and yet those states have slaves. And what Lincoln does not want to have happen is for those border states to secede to the Union, to secede from the Union, because had those border states seceded, then the Confederacy would have gained not only a lot more manpower to fight with, but they would have also obtained a lot more industrial output. One of the advantages that the Union possessed throughout the entire war was that it had far greater industrial output than the South had. And some of the strength of that industrial output was in these border states. And so Lincoln always had to play this tiptoe game to make sure that those states didn't secede. Now, in this fight, again, nobody thinks it's going to last very long. The advantages to both sides existed. And what I mean by that is the North had its advantages and the South had its advantages. I think the North had far more tangible advantages. They had a lot more railroads at their dispense. They had a lot more people that they could fight with. They had a lot more, as I already mentioned, industrial output. That is, they could make things like guns and bullets and shoes. They also had access to trade and commerce. And this is one of the reasons why the South is blockaded by the Union. The South, by contrast, they had home field advantage because the majority of this war was fought on their turf. They also had better generals. From hindsight, it looks inevitable that the South would lose simply because they didn't have the resources with which to fight. In fact, by the time 1864 rolls around and Ulysses S. Grant eventually becomes the lieutenant general of the Union armies, Ulysses S. Grant is going to change the strategy of the Union to one of attrition. And a strategy of attrition is basically one where you basically try to wipe out as many resources as you possibly can. And this is very important because the Confederacy simply doesn't have the manpower. At the start of the war, they have a population of about 9 million people. 4 million of that are slaves who will not be, organized to fight. Plus, you've got women and children and the elderly. And so the South simply doesn't have the resources with which to fight. And I think Grant recognizes that. And so he engages in a war of attrition. That stated, the Union forces really struggled finding good commanders. In fact, from 1861 all the way to 1865, the Union went through like 3 or 4 different generals. They went from Winfield Scott to McClellan to Henry Halleck to Grant, and underneath them there was all different groups of generals that were switched in and out. And so for the most part, even though it looks like the South would lose the war, they actually were the stronger fighting force from 1861 to 1863. Now, in 1863, the Union is going to have some very significant victories during the battles of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, among others. Vicksburg was incredibly important because it gave access to the Mississippi River to the Union forces, and that was important because the area between Vicksburg and Port Hudson along the Mississippi River there, when it was controlled by the Confederacy, that allowed for food to move from Texas and Louisiana into the other half of the South, into the Deep South. And once Vicksburg was won, the Union Army was able to take control over that, and basically they could cut off food supplies to the Confederate forces. But this was a war that was bloody, and part of the reason why it was bloody was because of the technology of the day. The new mini ball, the rifling of weapons allowed for folks to be able to shoot more accurately at longer distances. And the mini ball was a nasty piece of weaponry. One of the reasons why there were so many amputations during the war is because when this mini ball would hit you, it's not like a contemporary steel jacket bullet that goes in and hopefully comes out the other side. When these mini balls would go in, they'd flatten out and they'd bounce around, and there'd be no bone from here to here. So the only way to save you would be to cut the arm off, cut the leg off. It was a very difficult time. And in fact, the Industrial Revolution really transformed the Civil War into one of the world's first modern wars because the weaponry outpaced the strategies. And for the most part, most generals figured this out by the end of the war. Some had not. But the Civil War is going to see the introduction of the Gatling gun. You're going to see submarines. You're going to see the implementation of new Ironside, ironclad ships. You're going to see grenades. You're going to see all kinds of interesting new technological weapons, as well as telegraphs and railroads. All of these things were new in war, and it made the Civil War incredibly bloody. The current estimates put the death rate over 700,000 men, and therefore it was about 2% of the total population at the time. And many battles that took place in the Civil War, they had 20-30% casualty rates, and that's massive. And some of the most iconic battles in the Civil War, Gettysburg, for example, you see 50,000 plus people dead in 3 days. I mean, in the Battle of Gettysburg, within one afternoon, 15,000 people fell during Pickett's charge. It's incredibly problematic and deadly. More folks died of disease during the Civil War. Many of them died in prisoner of war camps. Perhaps the most notorious of POW camps was Andersonville Prison. There were a number of them. Andersonville was actually constructed in 1864, and I say constructed because there really wasn't much there. Elmira, another POW camp, that one was in the north. But the Civil War itself is really important, and I could go on and on and on and talk about the battles and all of this, but the thing that you need to understand is what the Civil War does. And there's two things I want to leave us here with. The first is, of course, the most obvious. It ends the institution of slavery. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery. It is issued as a war measure. The Emancipation Proclamation was initially told to the world, if you will, in September 1862. It comes out into public knowledge after the Battle of Antietam. And basically what Lincoln said in September of 1862 is, hey, I am going to issue this Emancipation Proclamation, and on January 1st, 1863, this thing's going to go into effect. Okay? Now, it's an interesting thing that Lincoln gives the South a number of months warning. And the reason why he does this is he's trying to basically bait the South back into the Union. Think about what the Emancipation Proclamation was supposed to do. It stated that all slaves in any state that is in a state of rebellion will be free once the emancipation goes into effect. Now, the emancipation does not free the slaves that are in the Union-held territories. Therefore, there were slaves in Missouri. The Emancipation Proclamation did not affect them. There were slaves in Tennessee. The Emancipation Proclamation did not affect them because it was a Union-controlled area. So it's only affecting the states that are in active rebellion. And so what Lincoln is really doing is he's saying, hey, here's the carrot on the stick. If you come back into the Union by January 1st, then you can keep your slaves. Now, no Southern state takes Lincoln up on his offer. But we have to understand what the Emancipation was really intending to do. The other thing that the Emancipation does is that it allows the Union to gain access to a number of different men. Okay, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. Instead, what it did is it convinced the slaves to free themselves. And once they started coming into Union camps, Lincoln ultimately decides that he is going to organize them into fighting groups. And so it increased the number of men that the Union could fight with. And then finally, it forestalled any foreign alliances that the South may have been working on, because no country was going to ally themselves with the South if the focus of the war was to keep the slaves. So the one thing that the Civil War does is it does ultimately set us up to ending slavery, and that's significant. But it doesn't end the racial tensions or the racial violence that created slavery. As we will see in lectures later on, that violence continues on. But the other thing that the Civil War accomplishes is that it creates the United States. Before the war, people referred to the United States as these United States, that is, in a pluralistic sort of way. The Civil War really does create a country for the first time, interestingly, if you come to think about it. And so the consequences of the Civil War are important, and I've already gone way over the time I normally like to go. But the Civil War is incredibly important. And in the end, I think we still are dealing with its legacy, and we still need to address the question, why is this war important, and why should we continue to study it? And hopefully that's a question that you will ponder. So that's what I got for you this week. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.